The world is going to be digitalized and datafied without anything left at all, in such a way that the real economy and the real society is digitalized. So, and that's a process that's rapidly taking place. And to actually therefore say that just like we look at feminist frameworks as something that deserves a space, but something that actually should permeate our analysis and our analytical frames, so also digital justice and discussions around data and digital at this point in time during the fluidity and the flux require a certain space, even as we recognize that all our analysis about climate, about labor rights, about everything else, democracy and media, should also have a digital dimension. So I completely do not want to subscribe to an essentialism, but I'm just pointing to the writing on the wall. So the whole idea is that it is extremely important to understand how this data is going to be owned, and by that data is not meant sensitive personal data. There are two kinds of data, sensitive personal data, and the second kind of data is aggregate, anonymized, societal data about which, from agriculture to everything is being implicated in that. And most importantly today, the companies that are going to rule the world are not Google. The companies are going to be companies like Bayer, which have rapidly acquired other companies because they want to watch the data and see.
Can you say what is
Bayer, which has acquired Monsanto, and it is rapidly acquired. Bayer. Because Bayer controls pharmaceutical information and Monsanto controls seed information, and they want to control agriculture. So the whole idea is that all your input and supply chains are going to rapidly change so that the real economy is going to be controlled by companies from the digital world and the non-digital world, all of which will be datafied. All of this is deeply, the intelligentsification of society is deeply linked to financialization. So I would like to understand from Geeta over a conversation, what is post-finance? I think it's not. I think the venture capital supporting these guys when they're not making profits. None of these companies is actually making profits. That is scary because we've entered a new state of globalization in which intelligentsification is happening with venture capitalism that's powering it despite the fact that there are no revenues. So I think that if we were to be terrorized equally by climate change and the crisis of democracy, then actually it's a Hobson's choice. Both those terrors are equally terrible.
I mean, it's kind of terrifying, but also what you're saying is, about data governance, that actually states really have to work in this area to kind of ensure that they have control, at least at that national level. I'm just thinking it would be very useful if we thought in terms of how we guide states, really practical something of what you need to do, because just as with trade negotiations, they often did not know what they were entering into, and it fell to NGOs to actually try to alert them, holding public meetings and saying, you can't sign on to this, this has these implications, and the whole big data area is something they're totally ignorant about. I'm still trying to get, I think most people in this room, our heads around this, to understand, exactly what is looming there and all of its implications. So sort of more practical ways in which we might, translate what the dangers are into concrete, guidelines.
Because when you think about the way in which technology is broken down certain boundaries, it has also created a crisis of institutions because in many ways there was already a democratic deficit in global to local institutions, but it has simply aggravated that. And the trust deficit that gets created in between is filled in by the right wing, filled in by all of those people, and also filled in by bots and algorithms, which in that affective domain of addiction to WhatsApp, which, we kind of seek that gratification, The bots are filling in those trust gaps. Am I getting a like on my Facebook picture? Am I liking? So there is, I think, a post-institutional form of free-flowing, where jurisdiction has now broken down, but the nation-state remains. I think that's a very critical piece to fix in the whole thing. And I was referring to the comments not as an overarching solution, but in the context that especially we need to come up with new governance mechanisms for issues like data and the digital. I was offering it as a means that we are already working on at IT for Change for the past 6 months to a year, and building a huge global momentum around how do you challenge this post-institutional free-for-all, winner-takes-all kind of default corporatization and marketization of everything through data. That's the idea. I just wanted to say that there are two things that you can take away and do if someone asks you to speak on data. One is, there are two kinds of data. One is the inalienable data. The world has to decide what cannot be datafied. We should stop now, no facial recognition technology. Secondly, I think you should also talk about collective ownership. Jane Kelsey is doing a lot of work around it with the Maoris. What is the idea of a community ownership of collective data, which can apply to a municipality, which can apply to a society? These are two very important things.
We don't see the digital as a separate space, as Anita was saying. We don't essentialize it. We look at all of our lived experiences and our lived knowledges as being both embodied and disembodied. And what we're doing is working between the embodied and the disembodied in the different contexts that we are. And at the core of it is recognizing, as I said in my one-pager, the crises and the opportunities of unknowing, that we do not know each other as fully and as well as we should or we could, and that there is, through that, ways of re-knowing and unlearning and relearning and urgency to the reimagining, right? So how we think of multiple ways of being and knowing, and then ways of doing and transforming and governing. So what are we doing? We operate very much on the insider-outsider principle. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the different spaces we're in right now and take one example. We're in Wikipedia, right? Very much so, for very good reasons, and I'll come back to it. We're starting to look at languages. So how is the internet multilingual? It is not, and I'll come back to it. What does internet design and architecture look like? So who is building these platforms? Who is building these tools? Who is governing these platforms and these tools? None of us. We're not in those spaces. And then, and this is particularly where feminist knowledge production, I think, is key, how do we build oral and visual archives to do this work? And the reason all of these 4 spaces are really important to us is because most of our knowledges and histories are oral and embodied. They're not textual. Text, in fact, has been a weapon of oppression for many of our communities around the world, including, for instance, the Dalit Bahujan in South Asia, but for many. The Maori did not have a written language. It is an oral language. And Google, our frenemies, do a little evil, make a lot of money. Google found about a few years ago that they estimated there have been 129 million books published ever in the world in 480 languages. There are over 7,000 spoken languages in the world. And language is a form of knowing. Every language we speak, and to what you were saying, Yvonne, and all of us here who are multilingual, we know this. Every time you speak in a different language, it's a different way of knowing. And so for us, language has been a really interesting sort of entry point to talking about different ways of knowing, because that's the kind of entry point that the white man from Europe can understand, right? We can't go to Maori culture yet. We'll get there.
I think we will need to come up with the alternatives in terms of the institutional frameworks to govern the world, because the institutions have crumbled, not just at the national level, but I think at the multilateral level. The multilateral playing field was always undemocratic. But what's happening now is that there is absolutely no concern for governments, and corporations have taken over. A couple of months ago, Jack Ma, who is the founder of Alibaba, he declared that there was no need for the multilateral trading system. Corporations, along with consumers, should be able to run the multilateral trade system. So that describes to you what the average person who runs e-commerce in a very successful way is thinking. And that's the way everyone would like, the capitalists would like to believe the world can be run. And unfortunately, I think governments have also started believing that it's good for this kind of a new re-socialized contract to be forged. It's also the management training that many of our bureaucrats have had in new public management theories that have somehow convinced them the way to go is to completely decimate the public. And that, I think, is a deep challenge for feminism. And the space that we had in the past few days did not allow us to get into the depths of how to reconstruct the public, how to reclaim those institutional nuts and bolts in a way that is adequate to the context that we are in. And as Sonia often likes to underline, and I completely agree with her, we have to work at both the level of individual subjectivities, which have been completely colonized, and at the level of the institutional frameworks, the rebuilding of institutional frameworks that somehow take us through into the 21st century. And that, I think, is an important thing that Dawn needs to engage in.